My name is Rachel Myers. With Peak Sustainability Group up here in Bellingham, Washington, and I'm going to facilitate the meeting tonight. So I will be a little bit of a, directing traffic and bringing us from one piece to the next and keeping us on schedule and all those good things that a facilitator can do. So I am actually going to share my screen. We wanted to just give everyone a chance to at least see some of the names and faces before we share screen, because then it gets more difficult for everybody to see. So let me share, and hopefully everyone can see my screen. It says Sea Level Rise Vulnerability Assessment, Town of Coupeville. You are in the right place if you can see that screen. So let's go ahead and just do a little bit of housekeeping before we dive into the bulk of the meeting. Let me move us forward. First of all, I wanted to let everyone know that this meeting is being recorded so that we can share out this information with neighbors and others who couldn't make it tonight. So that's just a heads up for everyone. Then I'm just going to share a few Zoom tips just to kind of get us all on the same page, set us up for success for this meeting. The first one is, if you happen to have a name underneath your your face or your box that isn't correct, so that you're sharing a Zoom account with someone else, would you mind going in there and renaming so that it's the correct name, so that as we interact, we'll know your name. And a few tips on how to do that. You can just see the screen here. You're all very well, very polite on Zoom. You're already muted. We'll ask that you stay on mute unless you are speaking to the group. And then please use the chat function. If you have any comments or questions along the way, we will have specific time for questions and answers. So rest assured that we'll have that time. But along the way, if you have a comment or question, we have folks watching that chat. So feel free to add a comment or a question into chat. And then during the Q&A, speaking of Q&A, if you have a question that you'd like to ask, you're welcome to type it into the chat, or raise your hand. You can, of course, raise your hand physically, but because there's so many folks on here, we may not be able to see you. So we would love it if you wouldn't mind using the reactions and actually hitting, oops, sorry, going the wrong way. Still going the wrong way. Just hitting that raise hand bar there on the bottom of your screen, and then that will zoom you to the top, and we'll know we can call on you and you can ask your question. So those are Zoom tips. We do have Sarah Parker here from Peak Sustainability Group, who is kind of our technical assistance person. So if you run into any trouble, you can chat her directly or just put a comment in the chat and she'll follow up with you. So I think that's all of the housekeeping. I also want to do some introductions and share some of the team who are here today to share with you all. We have two folks from Coastal Geologic Services. We have Jim Johannesson and Avery Maverick, and they're going to do a great presentation in just a bit. We also have Donna Keeler, who's the planning director for the town of Coupeville, and Joshua Engelbrecht, who's the assistant planner for the town of Coupeville, and they're going to be available to respond to Q&A as well as share some other context. I think I introduced myself. I hope I did, but some folks have joined us. So my name is Rachel Myers. I work with Peak Sustainability Group. I'll be your facilitator for our meeting. And now, I'm going to pass it over to Mayor Molly Hughes to just share some of her opening remarks and get us going. Mayor Molly, please take the mic.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. I just will be really quick. I really want to thank all of you, many of you who have registered and joined us this evening. It's fabulous. Thank you for giving us your time this evening. We appreciate your interest in this project and the subject, and your willingness to be part of our plan moving forward, or part of the solutions that we come up with to some of the mitigation we may need to do in the future. We're really excited to share the results of this study with you. Donna and Joshua and our gang of consultants have put a lot of work into this, and it's a really professional study and a good piece of work. And want to remind everybody that this sea level rise study is kind of our first step in collecting good data, setting good benchmarks, so that moving forward, we have a place to measure from. We feel like we're starting off with good information to begin with. And this study will be a part of our comp plan update that we're doing. It will be an important part of a climate mitigation plan in the future that the town hopes to do. And we're just really excited to have this information, not be relying on old information, which, as you know, our little towns can get stuck doing that sometimes. So we're happy to have current good information. I don't want to take any more of our time. I want to get right to the presentation and let you guys see all the good work and hear what you have to say. So thank you again for being here this evening.
Great. Thank you so much, Mayor Molly. I appreciate that. We're going to do a quick poll question just to practice getting used to typing something into the chat and to learn a little bit about the folks who are joining us tonight. So if you wouldn't mind typing in the chat, we'd love to hear, how long have you lived in Coupeville? So whether that's days, weeks, years, decades, we want to hear how long you have been in Coupeville. And you can watch the chat to see what is shared from everyone who's here. So while you're doing that, I'm going to just give you a preview of the agenda for tonight. So next on the agenda, after this sort of intro, we're going to have a short project overview by Sarah from Peak, kind of providing some context on the project and where we started and where we're at. Then we're going to jump into the presentation of sea level rise vulnerability assessment results with the Coastal Geologic Services team. And then following their presentation, as I mentioned before, tons of time for question and answers. We can dig into clarifying some of the information, just finding out more and making sense of what you've heard. And if time allows, which hopefully it will, we'll have time at the end for community discussion and input. So that's the agenda that we have planned for you. The goals for our time together, just to be crystal clear on that, are to obviously share the assessment, answer questions, gather your input, and capture aspirations and ideas for the next steps. So that's what we hope to walk away with at the end of our time together today. And with setting the stage, I would like to ask Sarah to share the project overview to give you a sense of where we're at in this process.
Great, thank you, Rachel. And before I jump into that, I just wanted to point to the chat. We had an acknowledgement of the lands that most of you are on today, which is the traditional homelands of the Coast Salish nations. So thank you for that acknowledgement and reminder. And with that, I'll provide a quick overview of the project, and then we'll jump into the meat of the presentation. So the Sea Level Rise Vulnerability Assessment Project is funded through the Department of Ecology's Shoreline Competitive Grant Program. It's in draft form right now. The assessment is in draft form, and it's available on the town's website. It began in earnest in late summer when the town hired Peak Sustainability Group and Coastal Geologic to complete the assessment. So Coastal Geologic has been working on the technical assessment, which includes a GIS analysis, and they're going to tell you all about that in just a minute here. And then Peak Sustainability Group has been focusing on engagement. So we currently have a survey open to the public. Please complete that if you haven't already. We've met with some potentially impacted landowners in Coupeville to give them kind of advance notice of the results of the assessment. And then, of course, tonight we have our public meeting where we're excited to share the results of the assessment and get your input. Our next steps after tonight will be to update the draft assessment with the input from our engagement efforts, and then finalize the assessment in April. And that will be the conclusion of this specific project. which the town will then move forward with in their next steps. And with that, I'll hand it over to Avery.
Great. I am going to stop sharing my screen so that Coastal Geologic can share their presentation.
All right. Here we go. Yeah, thanks a lot. And I think Jim's actually going to start us out on the CGS side.
Yeah, thanks everybody for attending. It's great to see a good group here. Virtual meeting hopefully is easy for folks. Yeah, we provided the technical expertise, coastal geology expertise, some coastal engineering, and particularly the mapping and what we call geographic information systems, GIS analysis. Avery's going to present most of the information tonight. I've worked with her for months on this project. I just wanted to kind of help kick it off here. I've been working on Whidbey Island for almost 30 years myself and surrounding counties. But there's been particularly a lot of work on Whidbey and Camano since there's so much shoreline and there's so much going on with the shoreline down there. Lots of active bluffs, beaches, estuaries, all of it. I'm a licensed engineering geologist. Avery is a licensed geologist. That's what those letters are after our name. So we're just going to run through our findings and give you some summary info. You go to the next slide, please. The outline for tonight, is going through the intro, the methods of what we've done. We're going to give you sort of a brief overview on that information. We don't have time to go through all of the nitty-gritty of the analysis. The characteristics of Coupeville, very briefly, as most of you probably know them quite well. The sea level rise projections that we're using a moderate level and a higher level from the current best available science that's out there from the UN and other groups. We're relying on the UN data primarily from their panel. We'll talk about erosion rates. We've used not only water level changes, but we projected erosion going forward as well. We'll give you the results of the assessment, and Avery will go through a whole series of maps that we produced. We'll give you a brief overview of some management options, which will mostly be in future stages of the project, and then have time for questions and discussion. Avery's managed the mapping of this project. I'm going to turn it over to her here.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Jim. So yeah, again, my name is Avery Maverick, and I'm a coastal geologist and the lead GIS analyst on the project. So I'll just start right in with the introduction and purpose of this project. So as a result of sea level rise, Puget Sound shores are going to be subjected to an increase in the magnitude and frequency of coastal flooding. So this is going to accelerate erosion, cause infrastructure damage, and possible habitat loss, as well as other impacts at the local scale. So the coastal communities such as Coupeville really needs to seek to understand the potential risks of sea level rise to their community to be able to plan and mitigate for those risks. So this assessment will become the foundation for the adaptation strategy, as Jim mentioned. And I think it's important to note that this project specifically focuses on sea level rise and is not on other impacts of climate change, such as increased rainfall or upland flooding. The overall conceptual model for this project was to couple recently developed sea level rise projections, high resolution land elevation data, publicly available data, and some data from the town to perform a quantitative assessment of sea level rise vulnerability. So to answer this question of vulnerability, we use the framework shown here for identifying and ranking impacts of sea level rise, which is a well-used framework used by NOAA and FEMA, as well as other local jurisdictions. So the framework can be simply written as vulnerability equals exposure plus sensitivity, where the exposure being the physical impacts of flooding as well as shore recession, whereas sensitivity is the degree to which assets are susceptible to the impacts of flooding or recession. Typically, these sea level rise vulnerability assessments only include the direct impacts of sea level rise due to flooding, but because of the town's physical characteristics, this would give a pretty incomplete picture of vulnerability here, which is why we felt that it was really important to include that in the assessment. And just so we're on the same page, recession is sometimes used interchangeably with erosion. However, recession is the net landward movement of a landform due to both erosion and mass wasting or landslides, and is expressed as a horizontal change in distance, so feet per year, let's say. The sensitivity assessment is more qualitative and so far has been based on input from the town as well as the type of assets and how other assessments have ranked certain asset sensitivity. This project was applied to assets, and for this project, we're viewing the central assets as buildings. So we've differentiated between historic, non-historic, critical infrastructure, roads. We have footpaths, we have the sewer, storm, and water utility lines, and then parks and community assets. And each of these assets groups have a map in the draft report. So I encourage you guys to check that out, which is online. We chose to evaluate the assets within a 200-foot buffer from the shore of mean high water, which is shown here in blue. And that's a useful approximation of the town's shoreline master program jurisdiction. So within this 200-foot buffer, there are 47 historic structures, 104 total structures, one critical infrastructure facility, the wastewater treatment plant. There's about 12,000 feet of roads, 23,000 feet of utility lines, and then we have the town park and path. We have the Front Street path, the wharf, beach access parcels, and the Thomas Coop Park. So just giving a little bit of background on Coupeville. So Coupeville is about 2 miles of shoreline, the majority of which is bluff back beach composed of a mix of glacial material, so not bedrock. The shore forms include feeder bluffs, which supply the majority of sediment to maintain the local beaches. There's also transport zones, which are banks and bluffs that don't contribute significant amount of sediment to the beaches and are thought to be a little bit more stable bluffs that are vegetated usually. And then accretion shore forms or depositional beaches such as the Spit. The shores here are exposed to moderate fetch and wave energy in Puget Sound terms, with the highest fetch coming from the northeast. There's also a significant amount of shore armor of various types. So there's bulkheads, revetments, seawalls with a range of conditions, but from what we can tell, most are fairly old. Getting into the local sea level rise, Port Townsend, the closest gauge to Coupeville, has measured seas that are rising about 2 millimeters a year, with Seattle being a little bit higher and Friday Harbor being a little bit lower. The most recent localized sea level rise projections for the state came out in 2018, and these projections vary across the state spatially based on vertical land movement. So due to tectonics, the Olympic Peninsula is gradually uplifting while Puget Sound and the town are subsiding. And so these projections are probabilistic, which means they give a range of values with different likelihoods that sea level rise will reach or exceed this level. So for example, the 50% probability of exceedance for 2050 for the town is 0.8 feet. And what that means is that there's a 50% chance that sea level rise will be equal to or greater than 0.8 feet by 2050. And so these projections are shown on the right here. We chose to utilize the high emission scenario, which is the RCP 8.5 as a conservative choice because most emission scenarios are exceeded in future assessments. We then opted to use the 50% and 1% probability of exceedance. The 50% can be seen as a moderate or a more likely scenario, whereas the 1% as a more extreme or less or lower likelihood. You can see these magnitudes on the bottom here. They range from 0.8 feet to 5.4. And again, we typically recommend choosing those higher values because to be more conservative. So for this assessment, we chose to analyze inundation during an extreme coastal water event that occurs during mean high water. And so we chose to use the maximum historic storm surge value from published models, which is 2.7 feet, and then added different levels of sea level rise. So we took the mean high water, we added the sea level rise, the storm surge to get our 4 different scenarios. And these are relative to the NAV-D88 datum, which is about 2.6 feet lower than mean low water. So this 12.6 feet here is about 10 feet above mean low water. These scenarios can be thought of as a moderate to high storm event, as water levels could be higher than mean high water, but wave run up was not included. And then we have the 2.7 feet of storm surge, which is quite high. We then use these values to map inundation extents using the 2014 topographic LiDAR data, which is shown here at the bottom. Okay, so I'm going to show, so here are the mapped inundation extents for the different scenarios, as well as current conditions, which is in blue. So the red and orange are the 2050 scenarios, and the yellows are the 2100. So the overwater structures, like along Front Street shown here, needed to be treated a little bit differently because the topographic data set didn't capture the building's elevations. So CGS actually conducted a separate survey to find the bottom floor elevations for each of these buildings, which we then used to identify at what water levels these buildings will be impacted by flooding. I also wanted to quickly touch on the recent December 27th storm, as I know that's pretty fresh on your guys' minds. This was a record water level in the region, and you can see here the Seattle gauge was initially surpassed, which is the main gauge in the region. Based on the storm surge values, we approximate that water levels reached 12.6 to 12.7 feet, NAVD88, which included 2.3 feet of storm surge. So this event was caused by a very low pressure system that occurred during a king's tide, but happened during relatively calm conditions without waves, which was pretty fortunate. So I just want to show you a couple pictures we have of Freeland Park, of Coupeville waterfront, and the wharf here. So these high tides and large storm surges do typically occur more often in winter months, but don't typically perfectly coincide like this one did. And so the important takeaway here is that this event is equivalent to the 2050 moderate scenario. So it kind of gives you an idea of what conditions could be like by 2050 during normal moderate storm events. And then moving on to local shore recession, historic bluff recession rates in the direct vicinity of Coupeville range from 0.13 feet to 0.2 feet a year along the north and east shore of Penn Cove. Here it's important to note that these are averages. So how recession typically occurs in change events, so a wind storm, then are followed by periods of stability. For this analysis, we chose to divide the shore of Coupeville into 8 different reaches based on a variety of factors, but mainly the mapped shore forms. And the feeder bluff dominated reaches were given a recession rate of 0.13 feet per year, whereas the transport and accretion shore forms were given a slower rate. So here are the 8 different reaches we created with the different shore types in the blues and greens and yellows. And then we have the geology as well as the topography. So from 1 to 8 here. So as we discussed, sea level rise will increase the frequency that water and waves will reach the base of the bluffs and banks along the town, which will increase the recession above historic rates. So we used some well-cited model to predict future recession. And using this equation shown here, we predict about 7 to 10 feet of recession by 2050 and up to 24 feet by 2100 for feeder bluff dominated reaches. And then we have the transport zone and accretion shore forms with slightly less recession. So shoreline armoring wasn't accounted for in our assessment, as it was assumed that shore protection wouldn't entirely preclude profile adjustment, and wave-induced erosion isn't typically the only driver of bluff erosion. Also, most shore armor along the town doesn't appear well engineered, is pretty old, and wasn't engineered to function with significant sea level rise. So here are these mapped recession zones. So 2050 in red and orange, 2100 in yellow, and the landward edge of these is the future bank crest. We also included the 20-foot recession buffer past those in green, as infrastructure that's that close to the bluff is still thought to be vulnerable. Okay, so now we're going to move on to results. So the results are going to be shown as a series of maps showing which assets or parts of assets are affected by flooding and recession. The red color in the maps are going to indicate the assets that will be affected first, and then colors ranging from orange and yellow progress to later affected assets related to higher water levels. So I'm going to first start with flooding, and then I'll move on to recession. So here are the results for building, again, with the red indicating the lowest lying buildings being impacted first. The hashed lines here indicate that these structures are historic. We see the majority of flooding occurs in the wharf area, the downtown Front Street, the wastewater treatment plant, and then this low-lying Parker Street neighborhood to the east of town. Moving on to roads, we only predict flooding along the wharf and wastewater treatment and boat ramp shown here, with different levels of flooding up the boat ramp. The only water line expected to be flooded is the water line that's under the wharf. And I was told that this was a private line. So you may have seen those black tubes underneath the wharf here. There's one sewer line on the west end of the wharf that's expected to be flooded, which is shown here. And then several ends of the stormwater outfall pipes are expected to be flooded along the wharf and on Front Street. There's a zoom in of those here. So just the very ends of them shown here. And then lastly, these maps show the parts of the parks and community assets that will be flooded during different scenarios above mean high water, because a lot of these do include tidal tidelands. So the town park shows some flooding above mean high water up to the current bluff toe. The wharf shows flooding in the nearer term, and the outer parts of Thomas Coop Park also show different levels of flooding. Okay, moving on to shore recession. Most of the overwater structures that are founded on the bluff are vulnerable in the near term. So that's not unexpected, as you guys likely understand. There's other discrete buildings along the shore that are also vulnerable. So on Madrona Way, as well in this Parker neighborhood, it's a little bit hard to discern here, but we have high resolution maps online, you can zoom in on these. Many of the road sections are threatened by shore recession even in the near term. So we have the Madrona Way area, the Front Street path and trail, which is also shown here, and then the Front Street itself, the one-lane road, both being threatened here. Similarly, the water lines along Madrona Way and Front Street are threatened by shore recession, both in the short and long term. So here. And then there's discrete areas of the sewer line, especially along Front Street and east of the wastewater treatment plant, that are threatened by recession in the near term. And input from the town's public works department mentioned that there's already issues with sinkholes in these areas. Additionally, over 30% of the town sewer flows under Front Street down to the wastewater treatment plant here. And then almost all the stormwater outfalls are expected to be threatened by shore recession in the near term, right here as they're along the bluff and bank. And then lastly, for shore recession, these are the sections of parks and community assets that are threatened by shore recession. The town park and connecting path, the Front Street trail, the Thomas Coop Park are shown to be especially threatened. So that's the red here. Okay, so that's the exposure part of this. I'm going to move on to the assets that are sensitive. There's our sensitivity rating, which I've shown here, the assets types and our sensitivity rating. I'm just going to go through this quickly, how we got to that conclusion. So we rated the non-historic buildings as having a moderate sensitivity. We recognize that these buildings can be easily damaged even by infrequent exposure to water and erosion or slope instability, but relocation or elevation of these structures can be possible. Additionally, impacts of specific residential buildings may not affect a large number of people in the town, whereas historic buildings are much less likely to be easily relocated or elevated due to the age, the construction type, or the conditions of the building. In some cases, the potential damage might only be limited to the lower floor, some of which do not appear highly utilized along Front Street. But structural damage to floor beams or joists may be threatened by sea level rise and storm waves. These buildings also have historical, cultural, and economic values, so that would affect more people in the town than residential buildings. There's several factors that contribute to the high sensitivity rating of the wastewater treatment plant. This is a facility that has interconnected network, so impacts to one part of the facility could lead to impacts to other parts of the utility lines. These could be pretty expensive to replace. The plant is in a fixed location and it's likely to have a really difficult time to relocate without completely rebuilding. And then lastly, obviously, this facility serves most of the residents of the town in the town limits. So this could affect a lot of different people. Roads could be easily impacted by repeated water exposure and coastal erosion and slope instability. This includes undermining on the coastal bluff where there's fill under the roadway. However, roads can be realigned or changed to one lane, which has occurred in the past, as you guys know, on Front Street. Roads do serve the entire public, so effects to the roads would impact a lot of people. And then road relocation can be pretty costly, so funding constraints contribute to the sensitivity of the asset. For utilities, a lot of these are located underground and protected from some of the direct impacts of sea level rise, but the water, storm, and sewer lines are not easily moved, and relocation it can be costly. And much like the wastewater treatment plant, impacts to these assets can affect a large number of people in the town. There also might be reduced access to these utilities due to rising seas, high tides, and storms. And then lastly, the potential impacts to the parks are mostly intermittent loss of lower elevation land, but may include built amenities. So impacts on the more natural areas of the forested bluff area within the town park are a less concern to the park as a whole, as these may have been designated for passive recreation or habitat preservation. The boat ramp at Thomas Coop Park is considered an emergency access point, though. So generally the impacts to this asset maybe affect recreational users, but besides the boat ramp, they're not seen as essential to the functionality of the town as a whole. Okay, so finally to the overall vulnerability results. So these are for the 2050 moderate scenario, so the lowest water level or the shortest term impacts. We have the percent of the asset that is impacted from flooding and recession in that 200-foot buffer. We have the sensitivity, and then we have our vulnerability rating here. So for the 2050 moderate scenario, we have the historic buildings and the sewer as rated high vulnerability here. Moving on to the 2100 scenario, or the greatest amount of sea level rise and the most conservative estimates, we see that the roads enter into that highest vulnerability category. And I think it's important to mention that these are generalized results for the asset as a whole. While we saw in the maps, there's individual parts of an asset, such as like a residential building, that may be categorized differently. We hope that you guys can look at those maps and look at those individual parts if you'd like. And just to sum up the basis for the high vulnerability rating, so we expect 25% of the historic buildings to be impacted in the nearer term and almost 40% in the long term, so by the end of the century. So that's why this is given that high vulnerability score along with the high sensitivity. And then these are just kind of the snippets of the highest impacted zones. Many of the roads are really close to the bluff, especially along Madrona Way and Front Street, and these are important assets and take time to relocate. So I'm just pulling out those most impacted areas shown here. And then sewer lines. So many of the sewer lines are located really close to the bluff crest, 50% threatened by the end of the century within that shoreline buffer. And again, this serves a lot of people in the town. And then lastly, while our analysis didn't show significant flooding in the nearer term scenarios for the wastewater treatment plant, because of how critical it is to the town and the potential challenges of implementing adaptive measures, we also want to highlight that this is an asset that needs to be a part of near term planning. So that's shown here. We have the flooding, encompassing almost the entire wastewater treatment plant here. And then, we're very, very close to the water shown here. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim to go over some of the management options.
Okay, thanks, Avery. That's great. You guys got to walk through the data and the findings. Just a quick word on perspective on the moderate versus the high sea level scenarios. As Avery said, there's past projections, which go back, more than 20 years from these international panels, have almost always been exceeded as time goes forward. The results have been higher than what was predicted. We got a lot of uncertainties in these projections. You've probably heard, if you've been looking at the news, the Antarctic ice melt and the Greenland ice cap melt are higher than have been modeled in the past. I flew over Greenland last year and I saw rivers and lakes on top of ice, and just rivers flowing like wild. So there's a lot of feedback mechanisms that are poorly understood as well. Melting of snow over tundra, for example, brings melting of the permafrost, brings methane and very active greenhouse gases and causing climate change into the atmosphere. So that's why we advocate using the higher scenarios, not only to be conservative, but in our opinion, to be more realistic of what's likely to happen as the century goes forward. So we've got just 3 slides on management options here, and they generally go from the lesser structural actions up to the more structural as we go through these 3. It turns out, if there's land available, the most effective long-term and typically the most cost-effective thing to do with eroding coastal property is to physically move it back. There's a picture here from Whidbey Island, not too far away on West Beach, with these condos on the top being moved back a few years ago. It solves the problem, for 100 or more years past the life of the building, as opposed to maintenance of structures. Now, quite often we don't have the land for that, so that's of course very site specific. These are called passive management techniques, as it says. Relocation pictured on the right. Elevation, I guess we don't have pictured, but some of the lowest elevation properties. This is becoming common around the region to raise these beach houses, these beach buildings up out of the way of flooding. If you visit the New York metropolitan area after Superstorm Sandy or other hurricanes, you see that beach houses are going up left and right. So on the left, you see Front Street there. That was many years ago. There was that couple landslides. I assisted the town in kind of coming up with the most cost-effective management option, which was simply to go down to 1 lane. Again, this was not a critical route. This is not an option for certain roads, but it was for this road. Drainage management through surface and groundwater drainage, pictured simply in the middle. Drainage causes a lot of landslides in many cases in winter precip months, and drainage management is a low-cost treatment as well for controlling slope erosion in particular. Vegetation management is keeping or enhancing the vegetation, which can help with erosion, but again, doesn't work in all cases. Next slide, please. So beach nourishment is another technique. These are all outlined in the Marine Shoreline Design Guidelines. If you want more information, which we authored 8 years ago for the state of Washington. Beach nourishment has been employed in many Whidbey Island locations. Here's a project in process, just simply adding gravel, and typically gravel and sand, to build up our beaches. Sometimes we're making higher berms for erosion control as well as minimizing coastal flooding. You can see this one's elevated several feet, for example, on the top. It depends on the situation, again, site specific, where there's too much coastal erosion or there's high amount of impacts. It's not necessarily feasible in all cases. Large wood, which is anchored logs, and typically in the Northwest, is another technique which can help control erosion, help control littoral transport or longshore transport of sediment, and control beach erosion and waves reaching beach backshores and bluffs. Sometimes these logs are partially buried, sometimes they're anchored cross-shore or longshore, sometimes in more complex situations. Again, we've got examples around the region. There's been a fair amount of monitoring of these projects as well, so we've got some data on a lot of these. The logs are typically used with beach nourishment as well, and sometimes vegetation, sometimes other structural actions as well. Next slide, please. So reslope and revegetation, also in the Marine Shoreline Design Guidelines. There's a photo on the right there. So that's slide repair without using heavy structural elements. So using very often drainage control, sometimes slope matting, sometimes some of the jute and anchored wood on the slope, small wood, and then extensive planting and maintenance of planting. So again, more for bluff measures sites. And then finally, the hard armor, the shoreline armor term has been used tonight, basically referring to any type of bulkhead, revetment, seawall, sometimes even larger structural elements can be combined with cross-shore structures and along-shore structures. Sometimes in the urban environment, this is the only option, such as in the downtown environment. It's important to know these are the most expensive options, and especially these days are the most difficult to permit. When there's a very critical need, they often can be permitted, but now they come with very high mitigation costs due to federal oversight from 3 different federal agencies, it turns out. So it's a long timeline, it gets very expensive. Again, this is the only option for certain places, sometimes combined with elevating structures behind them for long-term protection. So all of these need to have, feasibility analysis. There needs to be more analysis on the different assets around the city in a future stage. We just want to give you sort of a highlight of some of the common things. The wastewater treatment plant would need, specific site engineering. Possibly some of it could be elevated, some could be protected, some could be relocated. So, those get into the greater level of detail. So I think we'll leave it at that, and I'll let Avery wrap up this part of it.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Yeah, so just to go over some of the conclusions from this study. So we found that the direct impact from flooding is limited in the town, while impacts from shore recession is a lot more widespread. So as a whole, we found that the historic buildings, the roads, the sewer lines, and the wastewater treatment plant are the most vulnerable assets, while there's other individual parts of the assets that may be also highly vulnerable. And then we think that future planning should address these the most important assets that are exposed first. So these are the lowest elevation assets, the ones that are closest to the bluff. And then lastly, we just want to plug that this early adaptation planning at the local level can really help to limit damage and long-term costs. So that's it for our presentation. We just wanted to say thank you again for coming out. And here's our contact information here. And then I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
And we will open it up now for questions from everyone in the room. So again, you can type a question into chat or raise your hand. So we have a hand raised. Excellent. So Gary, will you go ahead and unmute yourself and just ask your question, please?
Sure. My question is about the stormwater outfalls, and if they are covered, what are the ramifications and the management options for that?
Yeah, I can jump in on that, Gary. Most of the stormwater outfalls in the town are coming down the bluff face, and typically coming from the cross streets and collected drainage that the town has done over the years, where in the past it was routine just to collect all the street drainage and run it out to the sound. When and if those need to get replaced or upgraded, there's often water quality measures that come into place. So there's a different era now than there was when they were put in. But to your specific question, they are not as vulnerable as many of the town assets, because since we have a bunch of elevation along Front Street, for example, they can simply be shortened a few feet if need be, or even if they are inundated at a very high tide, there's still enough elevation behind them so they're not going to physically back up onto the land. So you're actually, rather fortunate in that regard that we don't have a whole long low elevation barrier beach type of situation, which tends to suffer much more coastal flooding and much more drainage problems.
It looks like there's a question in the chat from John Mishasek, environmental staff worked on getting funds to remove hard armor so feeder fish would flourish in certain areas. How does feeder fish improvements calculate in the, I'm guessing in the decision?
Yeah, I'll continue with that one too. Thanks for that question, John. Yeah, the feeder fish or the forage fish, those are the, I think what you're saying is those are the food for adult salmon. And there are a lot of restoration projects that have gone on to enhance beaches. And in some cases where failing armor or unneeded bulkheads are present, they've been removed. The Mailer's Point, the Naval Air Station is one example of a larger project where some old 70s shore armoring was removed. And that allows more room for these little surf smelt and sand lance, used to be called bait fish, currently called forage fish, to have room to spawn, because they actually spawn on the upper beach. So that's exactly what the federal agencies are looking for. Like I mentioned, it's harder to get permits for hard bulkheads and structures because there's now, you have to look at every square foot of beach that would be impacted for impacts to these forage fish and other species. So there's always a trade-off of protecting a town versus habitat damage, and that's where these mitigation funds come into play when and if those kind of projects are allowed. So that's the short answer. It's a big topic around the region.
Do we have other questions? Folks can actually just unmute themselves and ask if they'd like to do that. Or again, type into the chat box. A new question just popped up from Gary. Has there been a cost analysis done for adaptation strategies?
Yeah, I'll continue. The short answer is no. We're not at that stage yet as part of that. This was to quantify the vulnerability. What's the problem? Where is the problem the worst? To help the town prioritize seeking additional funding, possibly planning changes and other actions to go forward. Hopefully there's more funding forthcoming since Ecology, State Department of Ecology already funded this. This is sort of a first step in the process to do more detailed work. Other towns and cities have done, they've gone a little further ahead, like the town of Olympia, for example, city of Olympia, and they're into the engineering stage and they're adding the millions and millions of dollars together for some of their infrastructure projects right now.
And Jim, were you just responding to the question from Julie about, is it typical for similar sized impacted communities to model out to 2100? Some people are just listening, so I just wanted to.
Oh, sure. So yeah, that's the next question. And the last one we see right now that Julie's put in. It is typical to model out to 2100. I mean, for new construction, it's typically assumed to last 75 years, particularly for residential construction and new buildings. So we want to be thinking about longer term impacts for infrastructure projects, which cost, a huge amount, water treatment, wastewater, all of these things. We want those structures to last as long as possible, hopefully 75 years without completely replacing or abandoning. So that is a common endpoint. City of Bellingham is using 2120 because a few years ago they decided they want to plan for 100 years. So yeah, that's an example too.
Great. Looks like Sean has a question. So go ahead and unmute yourself, Sean.
Okay, great. Hi. So I'm curious in the modeling, obviously in certain parts of town, it looks pretty precarious and lots of reasons to act. I'm curious in the modeling why you don't include other climate change impact areas. I think particularly for me, at seeing the latest flooding we had, the wind and rain combinations, and you mentioned yourself with, the changes going with ice cap melting, like why is that excluded from this study and at least not layered in actively? Because it feels like it's only going to look worse. So that's just a question. on methodology.
And Sean, you're referring mostly to rainfall and flooding from rain and streams, you mean?
You know, wind, I mean, when I observed on Front Street and, you know, we had a couple of buildings that had flooding, you know, with the king tide, and it was the wind action and the waves that actually really started to surpass levels we'd seen. And it feels like it's the combination of those things
Right.
that starts to really, you know, make the math model go wacky for planning, and excluding it, even though you have some worst case scenario in here, still feels like best case planning from like a layman's point of view. Cause I'm not, I'm like an observer and a concerned community member, but it feels like when you add those other things on, we might have even worse scenarios to deal with.
Right. Okay. So two quick answers to that. Relative, maybe it wasn't really the main part of your question, but relative to the flooding from rivers or rainfall, that was not in the scope of work. It was not in the grant. I think Avery mentioned that. And there's, you know, luckily the Skagit River does not run through the town of Coupeville, so it's not as big of a hazard, hopefully. We looked at several different options for modeling the coastal side of it. And we entertained bringing in wave energy. And we did a sound-wide study a year and plus ago. Well, we finished it up last year, where we did look at wave energy. So that would be more of a true worst case scenario if we're adding everything we've done and then added a foot or two of waves on top of that. We decided not to do that for this project because, you know, it's not a high wave area compared to the rest of North Puget Sound. There's not a large fetch or open water distance, but it is a significant issue. And that's another reason why we advocate, you know, looking more to the high scenario, because, you know, if you get the worst case scenario, it's very high predicted tide. It's around 2 feet of storm surge with a low pressure system, and then somewhere around 1 to maybe even 3 feet of waves. Now that doesn't last a long time, but it can do a lot of damage. Like I said, we didn't want to freak everybody out too, to use a layman's term, at looking at this absolute worst case, adding everything together, not to be too extreme. So that was some of the general reasoning that went into this.
Yeah, and if I could jump in, Jim, also, you know, just not using the most extreme, seeing that some of these buildings in the moderate to high storm scenario that already are impacted, you know, shows you something here. So if we chose the extreme for all and showed that all the buildings are red, all the buildings are impacted, that doesn't really pull out like how to prioritize which buildings are going to be impacted first, right? And so which ones to, you know, work on and figure out the strategies for going forward.
So maybe just to respond to that one additional question, because I think from an engineering solution perspective, I agree with you. You don't want to have like a full red map, then you don't know where to start. But for the most vulnerable structures, to plan for an extra 5 feet of water is a totally different solution than, you know, hey, we might have 1 to 2. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. I'm sure there's a lot of smart minds that are going to go there, but I was just trying to figure out for the areas that I focus on to make sure we're thinking, at least when we go to engineer a solution, it's got you know, longevity and robustness.
Great. Thanks for your question, Sean. Gary, I see your question. I'm going to read out a question that came in through chat first, and it's from Joe Grogan. It says, are there plans to do similar work further around Penn Cove, such as the full length of West Madrona Way?
Yeah, maybe Donna can jump in if she knows any more than me or Mayor Molly, but not that I know of. There's plans to do work there. Island County has done some planning, but they aren't quite at this state. That's Island County property, not quite at this state to do this level as far as I know. They have had some general work on sea level rise, and they've looked at marshes and some other issues. I know Madrona Way is very, very close. It's been close for many, many decades. I actually worked for the county 20 some years ago when we helped come up with the solution to shore up that bluff. There was a combination of sort of some new style of armor and bulkheads and some vegetation, some other things. I'm sure that's going to come around again and need some more analysis. I don't know if anybody else can add to that.
Yeah, Jim, thank you. Yeah, the county has done some studies already, sea level rise vulnerability study as well. I think it's probably more general. I haven't looked at it very carefully, but I think there's somebody, a couple people here from the county, if they want to jump in at all. But, well, just adding to that, our goal is when we start looking at solutions or alternatives or a strategy in the future, it would be nice for all the jurisdictions to work together on some of these things. And I've already had some discussions with the city of Langley, and I've mentioned it also to a couple folks at the county. So hopefully there'll be opportunity for us to work together on coming up with some strategies on a countywide basis.
Great, thanks. Gary, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. I'm very concerned about the wharf and the boat ramp, since we use both of those. Have you been consulting, collaborating with the port of Coupeville?
I don't know, Donna, if you want to jump in. We haven't worked specifically with the port, but we have looked at those same features. But Donna, I'm not sure if you can answer that.
The whole topic of sea level rise, started back with the photographs showing the mooring dock kind of even with the foundation of the wharf building. And so we've already gotten a quote from a company out of Everett to start the funding process for elevating the structure about 4 or 5 feet, and then elevating the actual causeway to bring it up to that new height. And boy, it is a big number. So we've already started the process for elevating.
John, I'm assuming you must be with the port.
Yes,
Okay.
District 2 Port Commissioner.
Just wanted to verify that.
Yep.
Excellent.
And could I just jump in and kind of remind everybody that this is a problem that affects town property, private property, Port of Coupeville property, as other, it'll affect Penco shellfish. It's going to have a lot of people that are going to have to participate in solutions and partner and work together, share information. But I just want to manage expectations a little bit that the little tiny town of Coupeville, it will not be the big, will not be providing all the answers or all the solutions. We're going to have to look at everything for the long term and see what is, we're just collecting to the point of having good data right now. So now the next step would be to look at what the different mitigation options are, what's appropriate for our shoreline, what's affordable, what's environmentally friendly, what's effective. There's a lot of new technology, a lot of new mitigation practices, best practices out there, as you can imagine, as everyone around the world is looking at this, and which is a good thing because there's a lot of good information to share. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayor Molly. A new question came in that I'll read out loud for those who are listening. Kathy Baxter asks, how does the structure of the port building and causeway affect the deposit of silt along that span? And is this significant with relation to water levels?
Yeah, I can answer that. I mean, some of those aerial photos actually show it pretty well, that it's a pile structure. It's been there forever. Let's just say it's been there a very long time. It has caused a little bit of accretion around it. It looks like, with the tidelands at low tide coming out waterward towards the wharf. That's not unusual. So it makes, a little more sand flats and similar there. It doesn't really affect water levels, though. It's something that has affected the beach and the tidelands, but the water levels are controlled by forces coming all the way from the ocean. and from our Puget Sound basins. So it has habitat issues and, different issues, but it will not affect the larger water level that'll be around the town.
Great, thank you, Jim. Any other questions while we have these experts in front of us? Or clarifications, comments? All right. Fantastic. Well, we still have a bit of time left and we still have a few things to cover. So thank you again to Avery and Jim for that wonderful and very informative presentation. I'm going to just move a few things around on my screen so I can see everyone and get us going on our next activity. We're a tiny bit behind the schedule that we had set out, but that's all right. We shall go ahead and, what we're going to do now, if you would be so amenable to this, is I'm just going to ask everyone in the meeting to take a minute or so to reflect on what you've just heard and the learning that we just had together during the Q&A as people reflected and asked more questions. And if you could go into the chat after you've had a minute to think and share your thoughts around these 3 questions, sort of reflecting on what you've heard. What is your biggest concern as you reflect on these findings? And then another question that we'd love to hear from you, or input that we'd like to get from you, is what question do you hope our community can answer as we plan our response to this study and these findings? And then the third one being, what aspirations do you have or hopes do you have for our community as we move forward in this process? So I just want to give, excuse me, everyone a little bit of time to reflect. I'll time you for a minute just to give you some space. And if you can type any of your thoughts into the chat, that would be really, really appreciated. Yeah, and if you could put what number prompt your, I just saw Gary say number 1 cost as a concern, which makes a lot of sense. So if you could put the number and any thoughts that are floating around in your head, I'll give everyone a minute. I'll actually stop talking so you can think. And we would just love to collect that input from you now, since we have a little bit of time. And you don't have to respond to all 3. You can just say, okay, my number 1 hope is this, and leave it at that. So don't feel pressured to answer all 3 questions. But this will be great input as we move into the next phases, as the mayor and Donna and Jim were all talking about. I'll give you just 30 more seconds. You can obviously keep typing if you're already typing. And if something comes up to, afterwards, after you're reflecting, let's say it's tomorrow, we'll share contact information so you can email in thoughts and ideas or other questions to Donna and Joshua as well.
And just out to everybody, there's no wrong answer. So don't be shy. We just want to hear your thoughts.
Perfect. Thank you, Donna. That's great. Yeah, and I see the responses coming in, which is great. And I know we don't have time to dig into every one of them, although I know I'm tempted to start reading them. So, but we will collect these and definitely reflect on these as we move forward. And we do actually have one more prompt that we are curious about as you are all typing and adding your input now. Another question that we have for you, because you're all experts on Coupeville, is as you looked at the maps and the sort of analysis that Avery and Jim shared, one thing we're curious about is whether there was an asset that's significant culturally or recreationally that you want to ensure is included as we move into this next phase of planning a response that you didn't notice. So if it's a place like we just wouldn't know that is a, beloved place to gather as a community, that kind of thing. We'd love it if you would throw that into those areas into the chat. And also, I just want, if you haven't taken the survey, which is still going to be up through February 25th, there is an opportunity within the survey to also identify those significant places. So we want to make sure we're not missing anything. That's really the ask for this part of the input. And so we really need your help to make sure that we cover all those bases and don't leave anything out that we definitely want to include. So I'll give folks just a minute to think about that and add that into the chat as well. I wish we were all in person together and we could like sticky note this out, but that was not in the cards for today, and it is very convenient for everyone to be able to participate this way. So that's a good thing. And I know I'm noticing some of the comments in the chat. We also want to recognize that, that it's going to take some time to process this information. Some of this is obviously hard to hear and hard to, process and understand, but this is really as many other people have said, the first step in this journey. So we get the data, we have the information we need so that we can take steps and take active steps, to mitigate and respond to the data. So I just want to acknowledge that if you're feeling that's to be expected. You all live there, you love your community, and this process is because you want to care for your community. So I just wanted to offer that comment as well. Oh, you're all typing in. This is great. I can't see, I can only see the chat when I look down. I appreciate this. Thank you so very much for, being here and for sharing your insights, and all of your questions earlier were amazing as well. We have a couple more things on the agenda before we wrap up. And I think I'll go ahead and let people keep typing and responding to our prompts. Hold on just a second. There we go. Again, just wanted a couple of quick requests before I passed it over to Donna to wrap up our time together. The first one, as we've already mentioned, is to complete the survey if you haven't done so, and then also to share the survey with any neighbors that you would like to do that with. We would love that, as well as sharing the recording of this meeting when it's available in a week or so. If you could share that out with neighbors, we've had an amazing engagement from the community, and we want to keep that going and get as many people engaged in this process as we can. So just wanted to do a pitch for that. And again, if you think of a question or a comment or something comes up, that I wish I had brought this up in the meeting, Joshua Engelbrecht would love to hear from you, and we'll incorporate your ideas and insights as we move the process forward. So thank you very much. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass it back over to Donna to share a few thoughts.
Thank you, Rachel. Great job facilitating tonight. And Jim and Avery, great presentation like always. Just want to thank all of you for being here tonight, for your thoughtful comments and questions, and you've given us a lot to think about. As far as next steps we're going to finalize this study probably over the next couple of months. We're going to make sure there is some policy language in the updated comprehensive plan that helps us move forward with coming up with an adaptation strategy. That's going to cost some money, just even doing the planning work. So we're in search of grant funds. So if you hear of anything, please let me know. I reached out to the Department of Ecology, but I understand there's also possibly some FEMA funding. So we're just keeping our eye out for it. And with that, I'm hoping to kind of put together a committee of sorts of kind of a technical advisory committee of citizens and others to participate in that adaptation strategy process. And I don't know how long it will take, but I think that's our next step now that we have this great data. I think most of us have a pretty good feeling, and we already knew which of these assets were vulnerable, but it's just nice to have the solid data that Avery and Jim put together to back that up. And I also want to give a shout out to Peak, and I know Sarah's here and her crew for a fantastic job with public outreach. The fact that you guys are all here tonight is because of them. So thank you for really a great job, both Peak and Coastal Geologic.
Thank you, Donna.
And Molly, do you have any closing comments?
I do just want to say a couple things. There's a lot of I just quickly was reading the chat comments, and everybody's concerned about money. Really appreciate that. We all know that any work on we all know from watching the port struggle through their projects that permitting and everything takes more money and time than it should. So I appreciate all that concern. I just want to reassure everybody, all the residents of Coupeville, that the little town of Coupeville does a really good job of getting grants. We look for grants for all of our public works projects. And did we say that this study has been done with a grant from Department of Ecology? Did we say that, Donna, tonight? I'm not sure if we did. But this study was funded with a grant that Donna got specifically for this purpose for the Department of Ecology. So we are constantly looking for grants. I joke and say that the staff is too good at getting grants. We can barely keep up with the amount of work we have to do with all the wonderful grants we get. And as you all know, there's a lot of talk about a lot of infrastructure money for the next several years. And so we will be watching that closely. We're very aware of how expensive this particular type of work is and how long it takes to get done. And so other than that, just a great crowd tonight. Oh my gosh, thank you so much for showing up, for listening, for your great comments. We really look forward to working with them and finishing this study up for everybody. Thank you.